In episode 22, titled OSINT, DNS and Internet Exposure, we're going to use Internet-facing signals to map an organization's external attack surface in a disciplined, evidence-based way. Pen Test Plus scenarios often expect you to reason from external clues without overclaiming, because the exam likes to test whether you can separate "this hints at a service" from "this proves exposure." Domains, DNS, and related public indicators are especially useful because they act like signposts pointing toward what services exist, how they are structured, and where an organization might have gaps. This is also a low-disturbance way to build hypotheses, which makes it a professional starting point when safety and minimal disruption are emphasized. The goal here is to help you build a mental map that starts with naming and resolving, moves through cautious inference, and then guides safe validation. By the end, you should be able to translate a handful of domain and DNS clues into a prioritized list of likely services to confirm without turning your work into noisy guessing. Domains and subdomains are best treated as service hints, not proof of exposure, because names can mislead even when they look obvious. A subdomain might suggest an application portal, an API, or an administrative interface, but the name alone does not prove what actually exists behind it. Organizations also use naming conventions that reflect internal structure, and those conventions can persist even after services are moved, retired, or renamed, which creates staleness risk. Some subdomains exist for staging, testing, or internal purposes and may not be reachable from the Internet, while others might be reachable but protected by strong controls, meaning visible does not equal vulnerable. On the exam, treating names as hints keeps you from choosing answers that assume certainty based on labeling alone. The professional move is to use domains to shape hypotheses about service types and priorities, and then confirm reality through safe, authorized validation steps. When you adopt that mindset, you become less vulnerable to trap answers that jump to conclusions. DNS record types can be understood in plain terms as the mechanisms that help names point to where services likely live, and the exam expects you to reason from that pointing without getting lost in jargon. Some records associate a name with an address, which suggests where a service might be hosted and what network surface might be involved. Other records point names to other names, which can suggest service layering, vendor hosting patterns, or a separation between friendly naming and underlying infrastructure. Some records describe where email and related messaging services are likely handled, which can matter for exposure and for understanding how identity and communication systems are structured. The key is not to memorize record type trivia for its own sake, but to recognize that DNS tells you where to look and what might exist, not what is definitively exposed. In exam questions, DNS clues often serve as context that makes one option more plausible than another, especially when choosing next steps in passive or low-impact discovery. When you interpret DNS in outcome terms, it becomes a practical input to decision-making rather than a technical rabbit hole. Certificates and TLS-related clues can reveal hosts and service names because certificate ecosystems often contain naming information that points to what systems are meant to be reachable. The key idea is that certificate naming can surface alternate names, related host names, and service naming patterns that help you understand the breadth of an external footprint. These are clues, not guarantees, because certificates can be issued broadly, reused, or left behind after changes, and the presence of a name does not prove that the service is currently exposed in the way you think. Still, certificate-related signals can be useful for discovering related surfaces that naming alone did not reveal, and for building a more complete hypothesis set. In exam scenarios, These clues matter because they illustrate that external exposure is not always obvious from a single domain name. They also reinforce the concept that evidence accumulation is stronger than single clue certainty, because a host name hinted by a certificate becomes more credible when it aligns with domain patterns and content clues. When you treat TLS clues as supporting evidence, you build more reliable maps without overstating what you know. Hosting and registrar information can suggest ownership patterns, but they must be interpreted carefully because hosting relationships do not always map cleanly to organizational control. Ownership patterns can help you distinguish between what appears to be first-party infrastructure and what appears to be hosted through third-party providers, which can affect both authorization and terms of service boundaries. Registrar and hosting signals can also reveal whether an organization uses centralized management or distributed ownership across business units, which can correlate with governance maturity and configuration consistency. The pitfall is assuming that a hosting provider name definitively identifies who controls configuration, because shared responsibility and managed services can blur that line. On exam questions, this kind of clue is often used to introduce constraints, such as third-party platforms that require special rules or careful coordination. A professional mindset uses ownership signals to ask better questions about boundaries, rather than to claim certainty about control. When you keep that caution, you avoid false assumptions that lead to scope or permission mistakes.
Content clues from public sites can also inform your external map, because redirects, error pages, and headers can hint at service families and deployment patterns without requiring invasive interaction.
Redirect behavior can indicate where traffic is meant to flow, which can reveal authentication gateways, portal structures, or separate domains for different services.
Error pages can accidentally reveal technology hints or misconfiguration patterns, though you should treat them as signals rather than as proof of vulnerability.
Headers and other visible markers can suggest the kind of platform in use and sometimes the presence of management surfaces. But again, inference is not confirmation.
The exam often frames these clues as part of a scenario where you need to decide what is most likely true or what should be validated next.
The ethical and professional approach is to observe what is publicly visible and to avoid turning that observation into disruptive testing without authorization. When content clues are combined with naming and DNS signals, they become a powerful way to prioritize which surfaces deserve careful confirmation.
Cloud exposure hints are increasingly important because many external surfaces now live in cloud services, and those services often have recognizable patterns in endpoints, identity portals, and storage naming. The key exam-relevant idea is that cloud exposure is frequently driven by configuration and identity boundary choices rather than by classic software vulnerabilities. Storage endpoints can hint at where data might be reachable, identity portals can indicate where authentication flows occur, and vendor patterns can suggest what responsibility boundaries exist between the organization and the platform. These are still hints, and you should avoid treating them as proof of access or proof of misconfiguration without validation. Pentest Plus prompts often include cloud cues to test whether you recognize that the external surface might be built from hosted services rather than from owned servers, which changes both methods and constraints. A professional approach uses cloud exposure hints to guide controlled validation steps and to prioritize identity and configuration checks. When you see cloud patterns, think in terms of permissions, exposure, and safe confirmation rather than in terms of exploiting a box. Building a prioritized list is the practical deliverable of this OSINT phase, and the priority logic should reflect value and risk rather than curiosity.
High-value services generally come first because they represent the most meaningful risk if exposure exists,
such as customer portals, authentication gateways, and sensitive workflow endpoints implied by the scenario.
Lower value or noisier targets come later because they often generate more operational noise and less meaningful evidence, especially if the engagement emphasizes minimal disruption. Prioritization also considers constraints because some services may be owned by third parties or may require special coordination, making them inappropriate to probe without clarification. In exam questions, you will often see answer choices that jump into noisy, broad actions immediately, and the better choice is frequently the one that builds a prioritized plan that starts with high-value confirmation under controlled conditions. A disciplined list also reduces wasted effort because you are not treating every discovered name as equally important. When you can justify your priority order, you demonstrate mature reasoning. There are pitfalls you need to guard against, and the exam often tests them subtly through scenario wording. Confusing staging with production is a common pitfall because naming conventions can be inconsistent and environments can overlap, so a staging label might not mean what you think. Mistaking shared hosting patterns for dedicated ownership is another pitfall because multiple services can appear to share infrastructure, and that can lead to wrong assumptions about control boundaries. Another pitfall is over-trusting single clues, such as assuming that a record implies exposure when it might be internal only or protected behind strong controls. Staleness is also a pitfall because DNS and public artifacts can lag behind operational reality, meaning a clue that was true last year may be misleading today. A professional approach treats these pitfalls as reasons to document uncertainty and to validate carefully rather than as reasons to stop. When you acknowledge these pitfalls, you naturally choose safer, evidence-building next steps. Now walk through a scenario where you turn DNS clues into likely services to validate, because this is where the mapping becomes practical. Imagine you identify a primary domain and notice a set of subdomains that suggest different functions, such as a portal, an API, and a support entry point. And you also see DNS pointing patterns that suggest some services are hosted in different places. From those clues, you form hypotheses about what each subdomain likely represents and which ones are highest value based on the organization's mission and likely data sensitivity. You then look for supporting evidence in content behavior, such as whether the portal redirects to an identity system or whether the API endpoint responds in a way that suggests a particular type of service. You treat each conclusion as a probability statement rather than as certainty, and you prioritize which hypotheses should be validated first based on impact and constraints. This is what the exam is testing when it provides multiple surface clues. Can you turn them into a rational, safe plan rather than a scattered set of guesses? The correct answer in such scenarios is usually the one that aligns with cautious inference and controlled confirmation. Safe next actions are those that confirm exposure without causing disruption, and the exam expects you to choose these, especially when safety and minimal disturbance are implied. Safe confirmation begins with low-impact checks that verify whether a service is reachable and what it appears to be at a high level, without pushing into disruptive activity or deep interaction prematurely. It also means respecting boundaries, such as avoiding methods that are prohibited by rules of engagement or touching third-party services without clarified authorization. The key is to confirm what is real before you invest effort in deep enumeration, and to do so at a pace and intensity that preserves stability and reduces unnecessary noise. In many questions, the best next step is a controlled confirmation step rather than a broad sweep, because a controlled step produces clear evidence with less risk. Safe actions are also easier to document and defend because they are tightly tied to a specific question and produce interpretable results. When you select safe next actions, you demonstrate professional judgment rather than impulse. Documenting uncertainty is part of doing OSINT professionally because this phase produces hypotheses, not final proof. You should be able to state what you suspect what evidence supports that suspicion, and what you have actually confirmed, keeping those categories separate. This prevents overstating findings and prevents stakeholders from treating an inferred service as a confirmed exposure, which can lead to misprioritized remediation. It also supports better testing decisions because it makes the next validation step explicit. You know what needs confirmation and why. In exam reasoning, documenting uncertainty maps to selecting answers that acknowledge what is known and what is not yet known, which is often the difference between a mature and an immature option. It also aligns with defensible reporting habits, because clear separation of inference and confirmation reduces contradictions later. When you can communicate uncertainty clearly, you become more credible, not less.
A concise memory anchor helps you remember the workflow, and a useful one is name, resolve, infer, validate, record. Name means identify relevant domains and subdomains as clues that suggest service categories. Resolve means interpret DNS and related pointing data to understand where services likely live and how names relate to infrastructure. Infer means combine naming, DNS, certificate, hosting, and content clues to form hypotheses, while remembering that inference is not proof. Validate means choose safe, low-impact confirmation steps under authorization and constraints to determine what is actually exposed. Record means document what was observed, what was inferred, what remains uncertain, and what the next step should be, keeping evidence and confidence clear. This anchor is short enough to use under exam pressure, and it matches the structured reasoning the exam rewards. If you can run the anchor mentally, you can answer what next questions with confidence.
In this episode, the mapping logic is that internet-facing signals help you identify likely external surfaces, but professional judgment requires you to treat those signals as hints that must be confirmed safely. Domains and subdomains suggest service functions, DNS and certificate clues support cautious inference, and hosting and content signals add context about ownership patterns and exposure behavior. Cloud patterns are increasingly central because configuration and identity boundaries drive much of modern external risk, making careful interpretation and validation essential. Build a prioritized list that starts with high-value services and keeps noisy actions late, and guard against pitfalls like confusing staging with production or assuming shared hosting implies control. Use the name resolve, infer, validate record anchor to keep your process disciplined, and then label one domain surface in your head by stating what you suspect it represents and what safe step would confirm it. When you can do that, you are thinking like a professional tester who maps exposure with evidence rather than with assumptions, which is exactly what Pen Test Plus wants to see.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.